Welcome back, everybody. In this week's video, we're going to be trimming the bowls that we've made in last week's production throwing video. And I'm going to show you how I trim when I am throwing production or a lot of pieces. So if you want to see some more efficient ways to center, trim, and finish your pieces, stick around and find out what they are. So I have 3 bowls to trim. And this is the oddball out of that set. This one's a little smaller, so I'm not really going to use my sizing techniques for the foot on this one. But I'm still going to be using the other trimming techniques to get this one done. And so normally when I throw production, I usually use something called a Griffin Grip, which is a self-centering tool where these arms go in to secure the piece. And then when I want it to release, I turn it out and then it releases. But some of you may not have this, especially because the price tag is pretty crazy. It's around $200. And it really only is necessary if you start throwing a lot of pieces, because it does save time. However, there is a free way to center without having to use wads, and I'm going to show you what that is right now. So I was getting some YouTube comments asking on how thick the bottom is and how to know how thick it is. So the first thing I recommend is checking for thickness by just putting your hand inside and outside like this and feeling how thick it is with your hands. Another way to also tell is looking at the bottom of your piece and seeing where the clay wall starts and goes up, and seeing that here you can kind of understand that my foot is about, or my base is about this thick. So that's about a little more than 3/8. So I have a rough idea of how much I need to trim. So when I trim, I know I can't go beyond this section or I'm going to break through. So when I trim without wads, I like using something called a water tension technique. So I get my piece, I get my sponge, and then I just gently apply a light layer of water on top of it. And then I also do the same on the pottery wheel. Then I get my piece, I flip it upside down, I put it on top of those water area, and then I move it around. And this starts creating tension and slip, and this will end up getting stuck eventually. And a lot of people center like this. You may have seen videos of Florian Gatsby center. And so from here, you can either tap center, or you find where it's off center, and then push it to center. And so this is another way that you can center your pieces, and it's really secure as long as you're not applying a lot of sideways pressure when you're trimming. And so that looks good to me. The rim is slightly off, so I could spend a little more time centering it based on the rim if I know that my rim is perfectly thrown center. Yeah, it looks a little better. And to ensure that this is stuck, I'm going to lightly tap to make sure it's stuck. And then from here, I'm pretty good to go. So I can start trimming. Now, the one thing I recommend before you start trimming is you definitely want to apply downwards pressure as you trim. And so there are tools you can use to help you apply downwards pressure. There are spinner tools you can buy. This one was from AliExpress. It was a few dollars. You put it in the center and you apply downwards pressure, and this will free spin and make sure that your piece doesn't fly off. And a cheaper alternative is you can get a coin, and I like ones with holes in it. So this is from Japan. This is a 50 yen piece, or a little less than 50 cents. And you put it as centered as possible. And then you just apply downwards pressure, and you can trim with that. Now, the one I prefer the most is you don't need a tool. You basically just spin the wheel and you trim a little indent, because I'm going to be trimming a foot, so this will end up becoming my bottom anyway. You trim a little indent that's slightly narrower than the tip of your finger, and you're going to just apply downwards pressure in there. And that just feels very natural because it basically satisfies that little indent like the coin. When I trim, I usually put my ring finger for my left hand here. I hold this in my palm like so, and then I connect the tools together. My middle finger's here on the edge, and I just start trimming like that. And so whenever you trim without wads, you always want to apply downwards pressure when you can, because it can pop off. Especially as you trim the outside, you want this tool here. And so when I trim production, this is usually what I do if I'm trimming without wads. And this will speed up a lot of time because you don't have to get your wads, you don't have to roll it up, and then your wads dry out, and then get it secure. And so getting used to this water tension technique does help. Now the only downside of it is the rim gets a little damaged, but that's easy enough to clean up. And so anyway, when I start trimming, I don't really put guidelines on my piece. I'm just looking at how wide the bowl is in comparison to the foot. And so for the first piece that I usually throw, I just kind of go by feel. Now, if you want to be very precise, if you know how much clay you use, you're taking notes on the size, the diameter, and all that, you can more or less take notes on how wide you want your foot to be. And then that way you can use calipers and a ruler to get it to a perfect width. But usually whenever I throw pieces, I throw it based on the bowl that I make, and then I make one master, and then I make the others to match. So in comparison, this looks good to me, and usually I use a rough rule of thumb. This should be 50% smaller than the whole diameter of the rim. Now it's not precise, but that's more or less my dimensions that I like to use. Alright, so I got my width that I like, and then the height of the foot. I usually try to make it a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch, depending on how much clay I have and the tools I'm using. So I have this tool here, and this is a little more than 1/4 inch. So that's the height that I currently have. And I have this weird bump, so I'm going to go down a little bit. So I'll flip to the round side and trim this down and work my way outwards towards 3 o'clock. And I did skip over a lot of my normal throwing steps, so if you want to see a more in-depth video, one of my first videos I released go over the trimming, and I plan to redo that video a little later. So if you want to see that redo and a remake, then let me know in the comments, and if I get enough, I'll remake that a little sooner. All right, anyway, I'm getting that edge in. This looks pretty good. It's definitely wobbly, but that's because of my throw lines. And so this more or less looks like the size that I want. And so now I'm going to start trimming the inside. And because I can't really apply downwards pressure and trim, I'm just going to hope that my piece is more or less stuck. So I'm starting from the middle, and I'm left-handed, so I'm using my left hand, and I'm working my way towards 430. And I'm not applying too much pressure, because if I apply too much pressure in one specific spot, it can gouge the clay, and then if it gouges, the whole piece can end up getting popped off. So for you righties out here, which most of you are, right hand, and then work your way outwards towards 3 o'clock. And this clay is a little on the drier side. I actually threw these a few weeks ago, and I was just wrapped up on a plastic board, so that's why it's a little dry. I did have to hydrate it with newspaper, but a little water when your trimmings are getting smaller flake-like will rehydrate the top layer, and then you just keep trimming again so it comes more off as ribbons. And so oftentimes whenever I throw pieces and I let it sit, it dries out, and so a little bit of water as you trim helps. Just add the water as you go. Okay, so I'm going to switch my tool. I have this bigger one here, and this is a Kemper tool, and I like this one because it just covers a lot of surface area. So whenever I'm trimming a flat area that's really wide, I can really trim this relatively fast. Okay. And then now when I trim the bottom, I always want this dome from end to end, and I want to make sure that my top is slightly higher than my bottom. And that helps because the dome will help prevent S-cracks from forming, because a dome is stronger than a flat. And it helps because I can actually slope this outer edge, because usually when most people throw, the middle is the thinnest and it gets a little thicker as it goes out. So as I slope this, I'm trying to get this slope here to match the height here. And so switching back and forth. And if you guys like this little holder here, this was 3D printed. And so eventually I want to start making some 3D printed pottery tools. And if you folks are interested in that, I can make some videos on 3D printed things. And the goal is to hopefully sell some of these to those who don't have access to 3D printers, because there's so many cool tools you can make and 3D print. So once again, if you like that and that's interesting to you, leave a comment below. I'm always interested in using technology to help the pottery process. Okay, so almost got my inside. I'm just using my trimming tool as more or less a rake. All right, trimming the inside, getting that nice clean angle. So for the lefties out here, I'm trimming this inward at 3 o'clock. And then right here, if you're righty, you're going to work towards midnight and then remove that edge. Because I want a nice vertical edge. Okay, so that looks more or less good. Now, I would create my undercut here. And so I have another trimming tool. This is a narrower loop tool. It is kind of scrunched. It got accidentally bent by a student, but I like it. It actually works out good because it's narrower. And so I'm just throwing this little undercut in here. And this is entirely optional. I do this because I like having a little flair, a little uniqueness to the bottom of the piece. And whenever I glaze and pick it up from the bottom, this gives me a little lip to grab. So it's easier to hold upside down because I often glaze the top of my piece and not the bottom in different orders. So being able to grip it and hold upside down is really important for my glazing process. And then one thing to keep in mind is this little corner here. If this gets too thin, it's more prone to chipping. So I always just round this out to kind of beef it up. And I don't want to thin it out too much. All right, so that looks pretty good. Now to clean up, I have a brush here that I'm just going to use to brush some of the rougher parts, mostly where the trimming areas are that my hands can't reach. And then I smooth that edge out. Then I'm going to use the sponge, and this sponge is amazing. This is a mud tool sponge. It's super soft and it's perfect for smoothing. The downside is this thing is not the cheapest. When I bought it about 6 or 7 years ago, it was about $8 a sponge, and back then that was like, wow, why is a sponge that much? I think now it's closer to like 15 to 20. So it is really expensive, but these can last a really long time, and they're really good for smoothing. I don't really use them for throwing just because they're so expensive, but to smooth pieces out, they are a dream because they're so soft. So I can link this in the description if you want to find it online. I've been told makeup applicator sponges work well too. I haven't tried it, but maybe I can test that out. But anyway, I got that smooth. This looks a little weird, so buff that out. And the last thing is just examine, make sure there's no rough parts around it. All right, so that looks pretty good. Now to pop this off. So to pop it off, what I want to do is position it so that my pegs are on my left and right. And then I'm going to dry my hands. I don't want it wet. And get any trimmings out of the way. So you're going to take your hands, you're going to put it around, and you're just going to lightly pull it towards you. And with enough gentle force, it should pop off. So if it doesn't, then you just rotate and try again, but it's shifted, so I can move it and then flip. Now looking at my rim, it did flatten a section out here. So I'm gonna go and get my sponge and just gently drape it over to smooth. And I can always sand the rim later after it's bisque fired if it still looks a little rough. All right, last step for these type of bowls is just examine the wavy throw lines. If there's any sharp looking edges, I would smooth that out with the sponge. So this looks a little on the sharper side. So I'm just gonna buff that out for the ones on the front cam. There we go. And this is my first bowl. And let's say I wanted to use this foot as the gauge for everything else for my other bowls. I would grab a caliper tool. I would position it across the center, push it to get the diameter, and this is what I would use for my size. Okay, so let's go ahead and trim the rest of the two and continue this trimming process. All right, so the same steps, get the sponge, coat the rim, add water to the wheel, flip, put it on top, move it around a little bit to build some slip, and then spin and tap center. Okay. Now I do find tap centering when it's secure with water a little more difficult. So if you're tapping and it's not budging, do the old school way of center, feel where it's off, and then push it to center. Or look at the rim in relation to the circle, and then push it to center. All right, that looks good. And now tap, or you can just push, and let's go ahead and trim. Okay, we're going to trim this one a little faster. So I get my indent. And then let's say I wanted that same size foot. Now I'd go and get my caliper tool. Make sure that it doesn't shift in diameter. Place it on top, and I just tilt one side. In this case, the right side of the tool, it's marking. So that creates my line, and that's all I really need. That is my width. And then so, when I'm trimming a lot, I use my bigger tool, and I'm just really getting this beveled. So I start by holding it at an angle, and I slowly rotate. Now, I gotta make sure not to trim too aggressively because only water is securing this. So I do have to be a little mindful of that. But once you get used to this type of centering technique, it definitely can speed up your whole trimming process. But like I said, I still prefer the Griffin Grip when I'm trimming a lot of pieces because I don't really damage the rim. And it just feels more secure in my opinion. Alright, so I got my width. I went a little beyond the size that I marked just so I can see how it looks because this bowl is bigger. And I'm going to trim this angle down. So two options. I'm going to switch to my other tool. This is the part that some students struggle with. So I'm going to take the tool. It's going to be at an angle. And then I'm going to slowly turn this towards midnight, like I'm turning a doorknob. So I start from here and I turn and I'm focusing the pressure on the bottom corner of the tool so that I go from this angle to a vertical. Now it's a little harder when you have to secure it down because you basically have to turn with one hand. So just for demo purposes, I'll show it like this. Angle and slowly start turning the tool. And as you do that, you can start creating this vertical edge. So I'm going to go back and do it like this way. So my middle finger here is preventing the tool from getting too close to that circle line that I made. So I turn it to get it vertical. There we go. It created this little trench here, so I'm going to go ahead and trim that down. And then now I just trim this down to get my height. So usually I like the rounder side, and I start from the edge that I made and I trim outwards. Or if you have this big, aggressive trimming tool, you just trim straight down and turn. And so I usually trim with 3 tools. One big to aggressively remove, one small for more delicate, and then the super small round to trim my indent. Always working outwards towards 3 o'clock, or in this case 4 o'clock. Okay. And then to check for thickness, if you didn't gauge it before by squeezing, one way that I really like is you put one finger on top, you take your trimming tool and you tap. The more vibration you feel, the thinner the clay is. The more round and full and hollow it sounds, usually the thinner the clay. But this all comes with experience and trimming multiple pieces, because depending on how wet the clay is, how dry the clay is, how wide your foot is, all changes the way it sounds and the way the vibration feels. But in general, the more vibration you feel, the thinner it is. So based on what I feel, I still have a good amount, so I could definitely trim to make it match the height of the foot on the outside. And then I'm going to add a little more water. So a few things to know about trimming. Whenever you trim and your pieces come off as little flakes instead of longer ribbons like this, that means your clay is too dry, and that can be not the best for not only your health, but your trimming tools. If the clay is really dry and it's creating little flakes, it wears down your metal trimming tools faster, and those flakes are more prone to turn into dust, and dust for clay is never a good thing to inhale. So always add water as necessary so that your trimmings come off as nice long ribbons. The only downside is that gets stuck to your piece, so just be careful with the amount of water you add. All right, working to get my slope. Okay, let's go ahead and get this edge established. So I'm using the corner of the tool. Actually, I'll use right-handed. Use the corner of the tool, working at midnight, and I'm just pushing that corner straight down to establish that right angle. Or you turn it vertical and then you push it towards midnight, and that also establishes that nice vertical edge. For lefties, you have the advantage. You just trim like you normally would at 3 o'clock, or you bevel and then you rotate up. So we're going to go ahead and switch to the voiceover mode with the time lapse. And so these next few steps, we're going to continue trimming the bottom, trying to get the height nice and sloped. So I switched between the bigger trimming tool and the smaller trimming tool, taking little bits at a time, tapping the bottom to make sure it's not too thin, and then going back and forth, cleaning up edges, getting the angles nice and defined, and making sure the foot's not too wide. Switching over to the smallest trimming tool to create the undercut, and then rounding the edge, and then final cleanup, removing all the trimmings. Switching to the last step, smoothing and burnishing with the sponge and my finger, and removing all the excess water that was added, and then the brush to reach areas my fingers could not. Now we're going to go ahead and pop it off, jiggling gently, and once it's off the wheel head, do the final smoothing with the sponge and water to remove any rough edges on the texture. And after that, this bowl is done, and we're ready to move on to bowl number 3. So let's move on to bowl number 3. Add the water to the rim, flip it upside down, add water to the wheel, water tension, and tap center to get it stuck. Next, moving into marking the foot lines with the caliper and creating a little indent for the ring finger to sit in, and removing all the excess clay on the edge, beveling, getting that angle set. And once it matches the exterior, then set the vertical line, vertical edge for the foot. Now lowering the height, adding water because it is dry, and cleaning it up, refining and removing any excess, and feathering that bottom curve to make it match the rest of the bowl. Final touch-ups, and now we're moving into the bottom. So for the bottom, always start from the center, work your way out. I'm left-handed, so I move it to 4 o'clock. Most righties will move it to 3 o'clock, and tap to make sure it's not too thin. And just keep going back and forth from the center to the exterior until you get the thickness that you want. And switching to the bigger tool to clean up the edges. Now setting the inside corner of the foot. Constantly tapping the bottom to make sure it's not too thin. Cleaning up the inside and outside edge. It got a little too wide, so I wanted it a little thinner. And whenever you trim the bottom, you always want it sloped. So the middle of the bottom should be the tallest, and it slopes down to the edge of the foot. And then switching to the small round trimming tool to create the undercut for the side of the foot. Cleaning up all the trimmings, and final steps, burnishing, adding water, and using your finger to smooth the clay. Brush where your finger can't reach. And then cleaning up the wheel, remove the extra trimmings so we can pop this thing off. And then finally wiping down the sides and the rim. So the rim is something that you should do, but the sides, most likely, if you don't have texture, this is not something you really need to do. But if you have some dings, dents, scratches, it's always good to buff them out at this step. And right there, we have the finished bowl. All right, and I'm going to be stamping the bottom of my piece. So I got my stamp, and then this is just my son's blocks that I just taped together, put some garbage bag plastic on it, and saran wrapped it with some paper towel underneath so it's soft. And so what I'm doing is I'm going to flip this upside down and then center the very middle onto here, so that when I stamp, I'm not going to punch through the bottom. So I just got to make sure it feels level. And then center my stamp with the center of the piece, and then just kind of rock it back and forth so I can get it depressed and pop it off, and then I got my stamp. And from here, I just let it dry out, and I can then glaze it. So if you folks want to see a video on me glazing these bowls, let me know in the comments below. And that's basically it. I have my 3 bowls, they're all trimmed, they're ready to dry, put into the kiln. So hopefully you learned something new about the adhesion centering without the wads. And if you like it, try it out, give it a shot on a piece that you're not too worried about. And just keep getting better at it, and you'll make your trimming go by a lot faster. But other than that, if you guys want to see anything else, let me know in the comments below, and I'll try to make videos for you guys. And if you like this kind of content, please don't be afraid to like and subscribe. That way it helps grow the channel, and you can see these videos as they're released every week. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.